All right, I want to go ahead and get started because we do have a lot to cover. So if you're still waiting in line for food, don't worry, you're not going to be rude by getting food and coming in. I've probably gotten a chance to know a lot of you. For those I haven't met, my name is Barrett Berger. I'm the Executive Director of the Center for the Advancement of Public Integrity, CAPI, here at the law school. For those of you that are law students that are not getting ready to graduate, we always have a number of good pro bono projects that we're working on. So if you still have hours that you need, feel free to reach out. And for those of you that will be around next year, we'll have a whole new set of projects that we'll be looking for volunteers for. So please consider working with CAPI. We would love to have you involved. So with that, I would like to turn the program over to my good friend Dan Alonzo, who is a former federal prosecutor at both the federal and the state level, and now is at Exeter, who is a great friend of CAPI. This is now our second event that we've done with Exeter and their Integrity Forum. So we are so privileged to have Exeter as one of our collaborators, and we're happy that we were able to get such a great group of panelists here today. So, Dan?
Good afternoon, everybody. If those of you who are getting your lunch would join us as soon as you can, we can get going. What we are going to do today, first of all, thank you all for coming. Thanks for coming at the lunch hour. We are going to have a discussion with four distinguished lawyers from four different Latin American countries. They are all partners in the most or among the most prominent law firms in their countries. And the reason that we invited them to come as part of Exeter's Integrity Forum was because of the very interesting and topical issue of transnational corruption as it affects Latin America. For those of you who are not particularly focused on transnational corruption, let me just give you a couple of seconds on it. I mean, what we're really talking about is things like the U.S. Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, the FCPA, the UK, and other countries have similar laws, and essentially the FCPA, for example, criminalizes people that are subject to it, which is essentially U.S. persons or companies that trade on our exchanges, and those companies and their executives are forbidden from giving payments, bribes essentially, to officials of foreign governments in exchange for keeping or retaining business. So essentially, think about what a big deal that is. As part of U.S. foreign policy, the U.S. is criminalizing transactions that might occur wholly within a different country, a different sovereign. So it is a pretty big deal. And you might ask yourselves, well, what do private lawyers have to do with this stuff? You might think initially, well, are they defending people that are accused of acts of corruption? And while that's sometimes true, as a general matter, the real importance of the private bar, both in the United States and abroad, is that a lot of these transnational corruption statutes and policies, the FCPA included, have as either a complete or a partial defense that a company who has paid such bribes had a pre-existing effective compliance program designed to prevent those kind of acts of corruption. So what corporate counsel tend to do, and what these gentlemen here are all expert in, is they tend to advise companies in how to design and implement programs that are effective in preventing this. They're not 100% effective, obviously, but they are, each country and each law firm represented up here is trying to push their clients in the right direction. So what we did was we picked four countries. We picked Brazil, Argentina, Colombia, and Mexico, and those are that was not a coincidence, right? They are all four countries that have a well-documented, long-standing, important corruption problem. They are, there is a list that most of you may be familiar with, the Transparency International keeps of ranking the 180 countries in the world from 1 being the cleanest to 180 being the most corrupt. That's usually North Korea or Iran. And the rankings for these four countries that are represented up here are Brazil is 105 out of 180, Colombia is 99, Mexico is 138, and Argentina is number 85. Those are not good numbers. The U.S., for reference, has recently fallen to about 22, which is not as good as the U.S. has been traditionally, but in the scheme of the world, we are a relatively non-corrupt country. So not incidentally, also, these four countries are practically the U.S.'s largest trading partners in the region. So we are going to turn to our panelists. Let me introduce them to you briefly so that you understand who they are. I'm going to start first with, on my far right, Gustavo Morales is a partner in the law firm of Marval, O'Farrell, and Mayral in Buenos Aires, in Argentina. He specializes in compliance, anti-corruption, and investigations. His law degree is from the Universidad Torcuato Di Tella in Buenos Aires, and he also has a master's degree in law from the University of Illinois College of Law. He has actually published a 2-volume treatise on global compliance called Tratado de Compliance, and he is a member of the New York State Bar, in addition to being an Argentine lawyer. On my far left is Eloy Rizoneto. He's a Brazilian lawyer. He's a partner at Cury Lopes Advogados in Sao Paulo. And he is also focused on investigation and complex litigation in his law firm KLA's Compliance Investigations and White Collar Group. He's been a visiting foreign associate at Miller and Chevalier in Washington, a very prominent FCPA-focused law firm. And he also has quite a bit of experience in transnational corruption. To my right is Daniel Rodriguez. He is a partner in CMS Rodriguez Asuero in Bogota, Colombia. He is the head of the public procurement area and co-leads compliance, banking and finance, and real estate and construction. He is admitted to more U.S. bars than I am. He's admitted to practice in the state of California and the state of New York, which is incredibly impressive. And last but not least is our friend from Mexico, Diego Sierra. He is a partner in Von Wobeser y Sierra, and he is in the anti-corruption and compliance and bankruptcy and restructuring practices. He acts as counsel in complex commercial litigation and in matters of anti-corruption compliance. So these are the perfect folks to tell you about what is the current state in their countries. They just arrived, and let me start with Eloy. Why don't you tell us, since you recently arrived from Brazil, up to the minute, what are sort of the 2 or 3 biggest issues right now that are going on in Brazil with respect to corruption? And before you do that, give about 30 seconds on the big corruption scandal that's been engulfing Brazil over the last 5 years.
Thank you. I'm going to speak a lot about corruption, which is something that creates problem, especially in third world countries or developing countries as Brazil. But I would like to start with a positive message for you all. You're going to hear a lot about what has happened in our country. And yes, we have corruption problems, but the bright side is that we've been enforcing anti-corruption legislations in our country, and we've been fighting hard against those who have rotten relations with the public government. So you're going to hear horrible things, but I want to share with you a positive answer. Before starting speaking about the car wash, how many of you heard about the car wash scandal? All right. So the car wash is basically the biggest corruption scheme that ever came to the light. What we've learned in 2014 is that if you wanted to do business with Petrobras, the Brazilian state oil company, you basically have to bribe public officials. The amounts 1 up to 5% of the contract you were willing to get. We're not speaking about $100 million contracts. We're speaking about $1 billion contracts. And what would politicians do with the money that they have received, the legal money they have received. They would finance their political campaigns. And in the sense, this somehow creates a distortion to Brazilian democracy, because we know that several political campaigns have been funded by illegal funds. I'm going to share with you some of the numbers from the car wash, just to let you know the dimension of it. I told you that it started with state oil company Petrobras, but what we've learned is that several infrastructure projects in Brazil, such like hydroelectric plants, oil refineries, nuclear plants, and even stadiums for the 2014 World Cup in Brazil were subject to bribes. The bribes were also in Brazilian banks, in pension funds, in highway concessions, at the Ministry of Health, in advertising contracts with the federal government, in seaport concessions, and when it comes to tax benefits and incentives. I could speak a lot about different sectors in which we found out there was corruption, but just wanted to give you an overview.
Eloy, when you said this was the biggest corruption scandal that had come to light, did you mean in Brazil or in the whole world?
I think in the whole world. There's probably other countries that are more corrupt than Brazil, but in a case that has been actually caught and enforced, I think it's probably the biggest one. To keep giving you a dimension of the size of the car wash, for example, two companies, Petrochemical and Odebrecht, a construction company, and my friends here in the panelists will speak a little bit on how Odebrecht was also involved in corruptive practices all over Latin America. These companies confessed to the Brazilian, US, and Swiss authorities that they had violated anti-corruption legislations, and they have paid fines of $3.5 billion. Another Brazilian company, JNF, which is the biggest meat processing company in Brazil, has also confessed to Brazilian authorities that they had bribed more than 1,000 congressmen in the municipality, state, and federal levels, and they have paid or assumed the obligation to pay a fine of $2.5 billion. But we're not speaking just about fines. I think we're also speaking about the fact that people are going to jail. I have the numbers updated up to March 2019, but since the start of the car wash, there were 242 convictions against 155 different individuals. You probably know one of them is Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, the most popular president in Brazilian story. He's actually facing jail right now. In addition to that, we have Marcelo Odebrecht. He's facing home jail right now, but he was the president of construction company Odebrecht. This is someone that we would believe a few years ago would be untouchable, and he spent time on jail. Joesley Batista, the major shareholder of this JNF company that I've mentioned, he also faced jail time. And when it comes to the crimes that have led to charges, what the Brazilian authorities learned is that $1.6 billion in bribes have paid. That's a lot of money. But now I think my mission here is to give you insights on what's going on in Brazil. And as a result of it, I would like to stress two important aspects. The first one, is the car wash investigation spreading to the judiciary? And we know that this is something really serious. What we've learned is that legislative and executive powers have been severely scrutinized, with several high-profile politicians under investigation, some of them already indicted or even convicted. On the other hand, nothing came to the light with respect to the judiciary. So if we're in a country in which there is high corruption, if the legislative and the executive powers are corrupt, what are the odds that the judiciary is also part of it? And why am I bringing this topic to discussion? Because we've recently learned that just Toffoli, the current president of the Supreme Federal Court, was mentioned in one of Marcelo Odebrecht's, that folk I have mentioned, plea agreement statements, as part of potential wrongdoings. According to this plea agreement of Marcelo Odebrecht, Toffoli would be known as the friend of the friend, and the first friend would be Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, our former president. And we have given Odebrecht benefits on certain multi-million-dollar construction bids while he was the general counsel of the federal government.
Let me stop you for a minute, Eloy. I think that I want to put some of that in perspective for those of you who are U.S. lawyers or lawyers-to-be, and to just give you a little bit of an idea where that fits in. So he just mentioned $1.5 billion in bribes, right? So, if you've got, just to put it on a smaller scale, if you've got a $100,000 contract, maybe somebody might demand a $5,000 bribe. So if the bribe is $1.5 billion, you can imagine how big the contracts were. And to put that in further perspective, we've never seen anything like that in the United States, ever. We've had our corruption scandals in the state of New York in recent years. Some of you may have followed that. We had the Speaker of the State Assembly. We had the head of the state Senate. Were both convicted in bribery schemes. The one involved a few $100,000. The other involved a few $1 million in bribes. We had one of the governor's top aides convicted a year ago, Joe Prococo, of bribe receiving, and that was a no-show job for his wife in several $100,000 at most. So the scale is just like nothing we've ever seen before. So I want to, Eloy, with your permission, if I can jump in and just ask the panelists before we get to your specific countries. It's obviously horrifying what Eloy just told us, and there are similar problems, I'm sure you would all agree, in your own countries. What's the problem? Why is it that it's so hard to root this stuff out in your countries? I'm assuming that it is hard. I'm assuming you'll all say, yes, it's very difficult. So why don't I start with you, then you from Colombia. Why is it that there are these problems that some might say are intractable?
Well, I just think corruption. So first of all, Professor Berger, thank you so much for organizing this. And I just think that corruption is something that is very difficult to measure. You have no idea, it may well happen that you have discovered a couple of matters in the U.S. that are $100 million. However, it is very difficult because no one keeps track of it. So I would say that corruption is all over the place. I have seen it in Asia, it's in Europe, it's in the U.S., it's at a state level in different places. And one of the things that happen is that every single scheme of corruption is actually structured in a way that people don't know. I was asked by someone a couple of weeks ago in an interview whether we have more corruption now than before, and the answer is I have no idea. There's no data to support that. But what I can tell you is that I have seen many investigations and more investigations where technology is a huge issue. So for instance, we have seen investigations and convictions based on WhatsApp. And now there's all the discussions at the DOJ level of whether or not you can use these instant messaging systems that erase. So the issue here is that technology, I don't know if there's more corruption, but there are more means to catch corruption.
But let me stop you there. You're saying that corruption occurs in secret, and so it's hard to know and hard to detect. That's true everywhere. That's even true in Finland, which is like #1 on the Transparency International list. So, but what is it about your country that has made it traditionally more difficult than in, say, Finland or in the United States? And let me suggest political will, political issues. Tell us about that.
Yeah, this is very obvious, and perhaps apologies for saying something that is very obvious, is underdevelopment. We are an underdeveloped country. We have problems at the judiciary, and in Colombia as well. We have problems at every single level. So at the end, my guess is that you don't see corruption here in the States at the DMV level. When you get your license, you get that type of corruption in these countries. The answer is underdevelopment, and some people think about, whether it's part of the culture, for instance. That may be an answer. I always bring out an example in the U.S., the blackout. You had a blackout in the U.S. for a couple of days, and it was disaster. So I don't think it's a cultural issue. I just underdevelopment, and we shall see these countries moving on, and in the next decade it will be better, and 100 years from now it will be better. So that's my answer.
Well, let me turn to Diego on that question. I do want to let you guys give a little bit of a presentation, but let me turn to you because this is a very interesting point. Your president, López Obrador, ran on an anti-corruption platform.
Yes.
Mexico is the worst one of the four on this list that I just read out. So what is it that has previously made it difficult for Mexico to root out corruption, and why do we think that now it's going to be any different with this new president?
You raise a fantastic question, Dan, and it's one that really keeps me up at night. And I try to study the phenomenon of why you look at the Transparency International map of the world and you see yellow, which are the countries that are the least corrupt, mainly in the United States, Canada, and some countries in Europe, and maybe very, very little, Singapore, Australia, and some of the mainly common law-driven countries. And I would challenge, being a little bit on Latin American, I would challenge Daniel's assertion that it's not cultural. I believe it is cultural. And it dates back to maybe even as far as the 17th century, between the way that our countries of the tradition, of the Spanish tradition of the philosophical approach to the exercise of power, vis-a-vis the traditional Hobbes and Locke exercise of power and the influence of Machiavelli in the common law tradition, as compared to the Saint Thomas of Aquinas tradition in Spain. The exercise of power for the Spanish crown was an exercise of power that sought to raise their people's standards of living towards giving them a closer approach to God. And that was the Catholic way of exercising power. When you contrast that to the Protestant way of exercising power that started predominating in the UK, they were much more driven towards two things. One, efficiency, and two, the separation and generation of different checks and balances. There were no checks and balances in the Spanish crown, period. The Spanish crown and the Catholic Church were one and the same. And then that sort of got broken down when you had Rousseau bringing these theories and the brilliance of the American experiment with their democracy in the late at the beginning of the 19th century. And then our countries, with Simón Bolívar in South America, started believing, well, yes, we should all be equal. And guess what? That was not our tradition. And then you fast forward that, and you look at how power was exercised throughout all of our countries, and you never had true functioning democracies in our countries, because that was just not the tradition of how power was exercised in our countries.
Let me stop you there. That's an excellent point. And let me turn to Gustavo. Right, you're also a country that was dominated by the Spanish crown centuries ago. You're also a country that perhaps differently than some of your colleagues up here has a highly educated populace, incredible natural resources. A fertile pampas, incredible, and yet here you are. Diego just psychoanalyzed Mexico. How do you psychoanalyze Argentina?
Well, he's Argentinian, okay?
I fully agree on the point that this is a cultural issue, right? Corruption, it's a matter of culture. And if you look deeper into that issue, I think that there are significant differences in how different countries comply with the law, not only with anti-corruption laws, but how countries comply with the law, right? I mean, in general, a friend of mine used to say, well, if you look at Anglo-Saxon countries, people tend to comply with the law because they know they will be punished, and they know the exact penalty they will suffer if they do not comply. When you look at Latin countries, people tend to comply, provided that they believe that it's a good idea to comply at that specific point in time. And I think that this general issue applies to corruption issues as well. And on top of that, from a practical point of view, it is clear to me, following up on what Daniel was saying, that corruption is concealed. We are talking about actions that are hidden from the eyes of third parties. There are significant efforts devoted to keep it really out of sight. And on top of that, the authorities have very limited resources. And that's when, this whole idea of rewarding companies for self-controlling themselves through compliance programs comes in. So obviously there are a number of reasons, and I think we just pointed out a number of them.
So to contrast again with our country here in the United States, I mean, you've heard that the Supreme Court of Brazil is now suspect. You've heard that the president of Brazil was prosecuted. Notwithstanding certain things that are going on right now in the U.S., as a general matter, those kind of things are foreign to our understanding, and so it is. I think the cultural issue is a reasonable one to talk about, and so let me use that to pivot. Let's talk about this idea of laws and policies trying to encourage companies to stop bribing. You've got a corrupt culture. You just psychoanalyzed it back centuries. How are you going to stop companies who are used to having public officials either hold their hand out or be amenable to being paid? How are you going to stop them from doing that in your countries? Who wants to take that? Daniel.
Yeah. So we are implementing several measures. The Colombia just entered. Who is from Latin America here? Who's from Colombia? Excellent. So Colombia is going through several processes. One, the peace process. Have anyone heard about the peace process in Colombia? We just went through a painful process with the Colombian guerrilla that had been there for 50 years. Then Colombia entered recently the OECD, and basically the OECD's assessment.
Explain what the OECD is.
Yeah, the organization of countries that basically it's a group of selected countries, among which the U.S., which has sponsored the anti-corruption efforts within the OECD, and basically the more developed economic countries are there, and Colombia just entered the OECD list group, selective group, and one of the assessment of the OECD was you have enough regulations, but you need enforcement. So to your point, Dan, we are working very hard on more enforcement, and we are doing it. We are now going through hundreds of very severe investigations, including every single level of the country, every single power of the country. And of course, you need to implement in Colombia rules that make efficient for people to come out. So for instance, we really need in Colombia a law, a whistleblowing provision. And so we are moving this forward according to the information that we have this year. We are going to have finally the whistleblowing provision in Colombia.
What is that? What's a whistleblowing?
So the whistleblowing provision basically is a provision according to which it gives incentives to whomever comes out, raises the hand, and comes to the authorities and actually blows the whistle as to a corruption act. And basically, it gets lots of incentives. It gets protection, a kind of labor type protection. It gets also a physical protection in Colombia and in some Latin countries as well. If you actually blow the whistle regarding a larger scandal, you can be killed. I mean, that's real. So actually, it also provides protection, personal protection for people. And then that's what we are suggesting in Congress. We had the honor to be the Colombian president's a counsel for that specific statute for Colombia. We drafted it for the government, who actually then presented it to Congress. the incentive is key, because, you know, if we don't incentivize people, what that creates, you know, from the other side of the coin, is that if we are here in a meeting that is, you know, no one wants to tell about, you're very afraid that your colleague here, you know, is going to blow the whistle and get a huge incentive on you.
Well, speaking of incentives, is there a financial incentive?
Yeah, financial incentive, and the discussions is just, this is shocking. It may be shocking. The initial proposal was to have an incentive of 40% of whatever was not stolen by corruption or recovered, which is a lot of money. And the issue, so what? We can have lots of people getting rich out of this, and lots will be hundreds by the hundred, but we will avoid lots of the corruption and change the cultural issue if that's so.
Dan, if I may chime in from the underdog position of these four countries represented here, I think you also need a component of a certain organized tension between society and power. And what I'm trying to say here is that the people need to generate such a level of stress from those in government that institutions need to change to become well-functioning institutions. And I believe that's similar to what happened in Brazil. And being absolutely honest, it's something that moved Mexico for its constitutional amendment to be passed in 2015, and then its secondary regulation to be enacted. People from organized society were the ones that drafted that regulation.
Constitutional amendment to do what? Tell folks.
A constitutional amendment to implement a national anti-corruption system in Mexico, with several complex institutions that are just starting to begin to be put in place. However, being very candid with the audience, right now we have a phenomenon of extreme concentration of power, and as you all know, from the American tradition of the Founding Fathers, when you have extreme concentration of power and lack of checks and balances, things don't usually go very well with regards to integrity. But I don't know, I would be very interested to hear, I mean, Colombia, you had, your Congress was literally in fire 20 years ago because of issues of lack of integrity and lack of rule of law. Similar extreme things were happening in Brazil a couple of decades ago, and now both of you have sort of, in the insolvency lingo, turned around your countries, and now you seem to be increasing standards of integrity, and something similar seems to be happening also in Argentina. I don't know, Eloy, what do you believe about this tension?
Yeah, if I may add, the first thing, I think technology has helped a lot for corruption cases to come to the light. With the internet, with the free press, many things that would have been, would never have come to the light a few years ago actually come nowadays. The second point, the fight against corruption played a very important role in the Brazilian elections we had in 2018. People are starting to learn that the money that is deviated by corruption, the distortion that is created, obviously creates problems for their daily lives. For example, the amount of money which was supposed to be used to education or to infrastructure is actually used wrongly. So I think education is a very important aspect. Another thing that I would like to add, it's with respect to culture. Both of you have mentioned, and this is something that we're going to need a few years. In Brazil, still many people are worried about the car wash. And I said, oh, I can't believe private companies have bribed political parties in exchange of contracts. But then they receive a speed fine, speed ticket, and they pay the police officer not to receive the speed ticket. And this is corruption anyway. So we still have a lot to evolve. But I believe we're on the right path.
So let me turn to Argentina. You first of all, tell us about, I want you to tell us about anti-corruption, because I know that's a passion of yours, about preventing corruption. But I think folks are interested in sort of the seedy details of what's going on in your countries. And your immediate past president is under indictment right now, right?
That's true. That's true.
Tell the audience briefly what the facts are.
Sure. I mean, let me first add two more points to the previous question. I mean, how do you fight corruption? I think there are two big elements to be considered. One is journalism They make a big difference in countries like ours. And the second one is that when you look at big multinational companies, I mean, these kind of cases usually turn into cross-border cases, right? So it's much harder for them to fight it because they are facing consequences in a number of countries. They are dealing with a number of prosecutors, and it's really a high cost. Going back to your, yeah.
This is a sort of an overarching question. You mentioned the OECD, which is spearheaded by the United States. You mentioned cross-border investigations. I talked about the FCPA. Do you guys think any of these positive changes in your countries would have happened without the United States' original impetus?
I would say that, I mean, the real reason for the most significant changes in Argentina in the past 3-4 years is Argentina's desire to become a full member of the OECD. I wouldn't relate it that much to the US,
Okay.
but I would relate it to the OECD.
What about you guys?
Yeah, I mean, me too. OECD is, and the US, of course, behind that. But let me, people just, this is a very, a quick comment. Those of you who are from Latam countries know what I'm saying. People are just sick of corruption. So as to your question, so people, the society, and everyone is like, everyone is aware that the most complex issue that we are facing now is corruption. I mean, that's the center of everything at the end. So I guess you ask, so whether or not, whether or not you would have changed, but I mean, without OECD and DS, and I think, I don't know, but the country has been working on anti-corruption regulations way before OECD, and the efforts are immense. We're devoting lots of efforts and lots of money. So I guess it's a matter of we understand that we need to change it, and we are doing something about it.
Do you want to add something?
No,
What do you think?
to your question,
Yeah.
I believe that the U.S.'s influence in the integrity costs in Mexico has been immense by means of course, its influence through the OECD and also through USAID. They've done a very intense work down in Mexico. And the application of the FCPA and how that permeates and flows down to how business is conducted in Mexico has the strongest of impacts. I mean, just in practical terms, where do you find corruption? Where there are big flows of money, and the largest flows of money are those from multinational corporations. And if they need to abide by the FCPA standards, then the integrity standards are automatically de facto raised, notwithstanding challenges in the
And
in the
I'll add that
jurisdiction.
the even bigger pots of money are in the government treasury. Right?
Absolutely.
So,
yes.
so tell us about President Cristina Fernandez and what she did, what she's accused of doing.
I mean, I think I can talk to you about the notebooks case, which is a large case, because the former president, Kirchner, she's involved in a number of cases, right? I mean, it's not that rare in Latin American countries that once, a president or a top minister leave office, they are later investigated for a number of actions they were involved in. Particularly, I think it makes sense to emphasize the notebooks case. We were saying before that corruption involves concealed actions, right? I mean, there is a strong effort to keep things out of, the public eye.
So what is the notebook?
But it's also true that corruption investigations can be triggered by the most unexpected situations. In this particular case, and this is a case which is the largest anti-corruption investigation in Argentine history, we are talking about a situation in which the driver, the chauffeur to a former top public official in Argentina, he was keeping handwritten notes for years about alleged actions that involved going from one place to another, close to the city of Buenos Aires, to pick up large bags of cash and deliver those bags of cash to top public officials.
Anybody know the American slang for a guy who does that? Bagman, right, exactly.
Not Batman, Bagman.
Bagman,
okay,
not Batman,
okay.
no.
So, I mean, and it's interesting, I was talking about journalism before. I mean, anyone can take a look at these notebooks because they are published, by the top newspapers in Argentina. So you can look at them, look at the notes, try to decide whether it makes sense, whether it's actually a bribery case or not. But the truth is that these notebooks, who ended up in the hands of journalists and then of the prosecutor. I mean, the whole thing was that the guy who wrote the notebooks was concerned because he was not having a good relationship with his wife. So he said, I don't want her to disclose the notebooks, so I'm going to give the notebooks to a friend. That's what he did. And the friend didn't feel so good about the notebooks. So he gave the notebooks to a journalist, who in turn gave the notebooks to a prosecutor. So, I mean, it's true, corruption is concealed, but also it's very difficult, to keep absolute control. The case nowadays involves dozens of defendants. The top businessmen in the country have been called to give testimony. Top current and former public officials have been called to give testimony. A large number of them are facing or have faced preventive detention. This is also the first case in which a new law, a recent law passed in 2016, granting benefits to defendants who cooperated with the authorities is being truly applied. And this has triggered a situation in which people, defendants want to speak, want to collaborate and give information to the investigators. We have not seen that in previous cases.
That's very important. That's not been the culture in your countries, to have cooperating witnesses, whereas that's fundamental, as Professor Berger knows well from her time as a federal prosecutor, and I know, fundamental to rooting out corruption cases in the United States. Without cooperating witnesses, maybe we would get the people at DMV or the police officer who's not writing a ticket, but it would be very difficult to get cases like the ones I mentioned earlier with the heads of the New York State Legislature.
That's really true. Sorry, I mean, to give you kind of some figures, there are statistics by NGOs saying that corruption investigations in Argentina could last around 15 years, in some cases over 20 years. This case, the notebooks case, is the fastest investigation ever, and it's exactly because of cooperating defendants.
Just a short anecdote about information and concealed information and technology. The single largest corruption scandal that we have seen in Colombia, there are two, one of a refinery and another one is the construction carousel of Bogota, which is basically a corruption scheme around infrastructure in Bogota. These guys came to our restaurant, just a few blocks from my office. They sat down. They start to kind of say, this is for you, this is for me, you're going to pay me this, the mayor is going to pay me that. And there was a journalist on the other, table, and he was listening, listening, this is a true story, okay? And they say, okay, we're done, fully closed, shake hands, we split, the pie, and suddenly they had everything written, not in the WhatsApp, but on the table, on the el mantel? The tablecloth. So it was a paper tablecloth, and they left, shake hands, and the journalist took that. Next day, listen, 6 a.m., it was all over the papers. So that's a true story. It's on the papers. So not only it conceals stories, and that's also a new anecdote to your papers.
Well, this is, I hadn't planned to talk about the press, but it is such an important topic, particularly, again, given what's going on in the U.S., how important a free press is to keeping government honest. So let me ask you, does Mexico have a sufficiently independent press that public officials can be kept honest in the way that our two colleagues said?
The press is being constantly challenged every day by the president's morning press conferences. That's just the sheer reality, and he goes every day in the morning to for those of you who do not know, we have a new president. He was elected by a landslide, over 50% of the electoral votes in June 2018, and President Andrés Manuel López Obrador, also known as AMLO, gives daily press conferences. He likes to be on the spotlight and to command the public agenda. And every single morning, he says that those newspapers that are criticizing him are the enemy of the people. Does that sound familiar? So President López Obrador is constantly challenging the press, but that he's not the one who invented this, obviously, and in previous administration there was also very strong challenges from the executive, a little bit more subtle, against free press. But, and this is a very important but, the free press that exists in Mexico has unraveled the largest scandals of corruption in Mexico. And just to give you some statistics, in the past couple of years, there were 16 former governors that were being prosecuted or who were facing charges for corruption from many different parties. So what I'm trying to convey with this is, if you go 10 years back in the past, you would see no former governor being prosecuted. So as a consequence of independent journalism, accusations are being brought.
That's great. I want to ask one more question on this topic, but let me ask you all to think of questions because I want to have a nice amount of time. I think we'll have about 10 minutes for audience questions, so please think of them. Let me turn to you, Eloy, just with my last question. It's about the press. Around the time that the Brazilian law that allowed for corporations to be held liable was passed in 2013, I remember going to a talk by a Brazilian public official who said that in Brazil, nobody's afraid of the police or the prosecutors, but they're really, really afraid of an article in the newspaper. Do you agree, and is that still true today?
Well, I would be worried about prosecutors as well.
Today?
Today, of course. But at that time, I mean, you can't control what goes to the press. And it reminds me back of something that I was speaking in the very beginning of the presentation. I mentioned that there was a press report stating that the president of the Supreme Federal Court would have been allegedly involved in a corruption scandal. Do you know what the Supreme Federal Court did on April 15th? They demanded the magazine to remove the article.
Censorship?
Yes, definitely censorship by the institution who was supposed to guard our Constitution, and freedom of speech is part of it. It's very important for us.
By the way, they demanded as a demand, or they issued a court order?
They issued a court order.
Yeah, very different.
Yeah. Wow. But there was so much pressure from other ministers of the Supreme Federal Court and the press and citizens in general that 4 days after the decision has been overruled ex officio. But one interesting thing, notwithstanding the fact that there was this order demanding or ordering the removal of the article, everyone had access to it through WhatsApp and things like that. So not even court orders are enough to prevent information from being spread. And interesting fact, this is a very small magazine. It's called Cruzoé, an online magazine. Nobody had cared about the existence of this press report until the decision. So crazy thing.
Great. All right, I would like to open it up to questions. If you, I'm not a law professor, so I'm not going to call on you, I promise. But it would be great to hear from folks. Yes, all the way in the back, sir.
Yeah, just like to raise a couple of quick points. I understand that roughly 90% of the cocaine that's seized coming into this country comes from Colombia. And then we have the Brazilians cutting down the Amazon forest, contributing to global warming. And lastly, the murder rates in all of these countries that are on the panel are quite high. Those are my thoughts.
Okay, well.
May I?
Sure. I mean, you don't have to answer that. We're not talking politics.
No. But I mean, thank you for your question. Perhaps the one of the issues that we are facing, to give some background, is that yes, we have. I mean, this is nothing that we need to hide. Hopefully, we'll keep on fighting it, and someday that information, which I have no idea, but I assume is true, and exact will change. However, we are facing now with an additional problem to drugs, which is Venezuela. Venezuela now is facing, as you all know, a very challenging moment, and so lots of the drug trafficking efforts that we have been, working on for the last year with, paying taxes and trying to fight it, which we are. Every single person that I have met in my life is against it. The issue is that now we have Venezuela, so drug comes out of the country through Venezuela, and this is all over the news, by the way, and they basically are a great gateway to narco traffic. But we still have a huge issue, and actually something which is worse, which cocaine fields are growing. After the peace process, well, that's one of the crises, is growing. So we know that unless we actually fight, narco traffic really hard, we aren't going to get anywhere. Yeah. So
I will say that it's not coincidence that the top anti-corruption organization in the world is called Transparency International. So I think that the first step here is that these countries not sweep under the rug the problems that you just mentioned. They're well aware that those problems exist, and the key is, are people of goodwill going to actually combat them? Yes, sir.
Hello. So to piggyback off what the previous person just said and what you guys were saying about how America is ranked at 22, how does actions from America come out in these countries as far as America protecting its interests? Because historically, what happens in borders,
Protecting what? Sorry.
Americans' interests. So,
Interests, yeah.
like Iran-Contra scandal and everything like that. As far as Free Ricky Ross, I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with him, the drug lord from LA who is credited with crack cocaine, and he said some of his connects were members of the CIA, et cetera, et cetera. And a lot of these, American companies who behave in America, but when they go to other places around the world, they tend to wreak havoc. What is being said about that, and how do governments who aren't able to basically push back Americans' interests as far as military might, if they don't comply, they find someone to replace them? There's like books about Confederation of Economic Hitmen and stuff like that. So I just want to know, how does America's image in America compare with its act specifically to the CIA outside of America and the consequences in third world countries?
So I think the question is about companies and the United States government upholding its interests abroad, and perhaps not always in the most honest way. How does that affect negatively or maybe even positively your countries? Who wants to take that?
I'll take it very quickly. I think part of what you're describing is the spirit behind the enactment of the FCPA. It was precisely because of a recognition by the United States Congress that sometimes its companies did not do business in the way that they should, with the standards of integrity that this country upholds, that corrupting public officials outside of the boundaries of the United States is punished. And so I think that's the greatest sign of how of the level of commitment of the United States to the cause of integrity, that it will not allow its own companies and those that participate in its own exchange markets to tolerate corruption.
And what happens if a U.S. company, let's call it Hallmark, decides to go to Mexico and pay a lot of bribes? What happens then?
It will run the risk of eventually being sanctioned and have to spend hundreds of millions of dollars just in advisors' fees, and then eventually a very strong sanction with the U.S. authorities.
Into the billions sometimes.
Yes.
If I may.
You want to add?
Yeah, I hear many people in Brazil saying, why doesn't the U.S. mind their own business? Why do they want to enforce transnational anti-corruption legislations in Brazil? And my answer to them is simple. You've decided as a company to access the U.S. capital markets. They have this legislation. If you want to access the capital markets, you're subject to it. That's it. Simple as that.
Yeah, but the U.S. has gone even further. Just very briefly, it actually, in the Obama administration, it was the stated foreign policy of the United States to change behavior in other countries, to actually make those countries more honest. Right? That's a very big deal to kind of stay, and its government, at least on its surface, being very benevolent. The Trump administration has not, by the way, embraced that, but they haven't stopped enforcing the FCPA at all. Yes, question here.
Hi, thank you guys for being here. It's really great to have your expertise on this issue. So my question is, if you think that corruption prosecutions should, is there anything different about how they should be handled versus other legal cases? And something that I'm thinking about is in Brazil, how a lot of the car wash prosecution happened very quickly under Sergio Moro, whether or not, that speed, or like if there are any other things that should make these cases different from others.
I'm not sure I understood the question, maybe.
So just in thinking about if the courts should act differently to prosecute corruption, especially big scandals like car wash versus other types of
Should they be
cases.
handled differently than other kinds of crime?
And are you making reference to the standard of proof beyond reasonable doubt, or versus?
Yeah, I mean, anything that you...
Yeah, I think I have an idea in regard to that point. We should make a distinction in terms of large corruption and small corruption, right? In our countries, most of the times, giving gifts to public officials is a crime, right? And that's a crime, just like paying a huge bribe in the millions of dollars for the largest government contract is a crime as well. But the point that we see in real life, in practice, is that when you start investigating these large cases, like car wash, like the notebooks case in Argentina, you realize that the situation is huge. And most of the time, prosecutors, the courts, they do not have enough resources to deal with all of the information they are getting, right? So it's important to realize that huge cases require huge resources, and it will take time. And these kind of investigations continue to spread, you know. Car wash, we were discussing with the law, it has been going on for over 5 years, and they are still triggering side investigations because of new information they are uncovering. Same situation with the notebooks case in Argentina. So in terms of size and complexity, these are very specific cases that require particular knowledge and also relevant resources.
We have time for one last question, or? I think we got to get out of here. Okay, please join me in thanking our panelists.